My name is Adam Abel. I'm the NRCS State Grazing Specialist. I've had the opportunity to do grazing work in some shape or form for over 20 years now, which has been a real joy in my life. I grew up on a rotational grazing farm. My father got into it, not because he wanted to, but because he was forced to from stray voltage. He came to grazing kicking and screaming, and still one of the best decisions that he ever made. That said, I use this quote quite a bit because it's something that I've observed when I start talking to people about grazing and grazing planning, and if you're talking about transitioning a property over to rotational grazing. It's Henry Ford's quote, and it's whether you think you can or you think you can't, you are right. I want to stress that because I've observed that grazing's kind of a little bit of a mental game, especially if you come from, let's say, a traditional farm background where, you know, your grandfather cut the hay and put it in the silo, and then your dad cut the hay and put it in the silo, and now you're talking about this crazy idea of putting cows out on pasture or having animals graze all summer long. Like, who does that? That's going back to the 1700s. How could that possibly work? And I think that not only with a good grazing plan and working with people who've got experience, rely on experience, that's one of the ways that you can actually transition that. So I've got some colleagues here, some friends that I've had the opportunity to work with over the last number of years, and we're hoping to make some more headway with that because we see the true benefits of rotational grazing. More than just, you know, it's multifold. It's landscape, it's human, it's your family, it's the environment. Everything about it's got an opportunity. And it's not for everybody, but if you want to do this, I can't stress enough. Set these systems up so that way you can be successful from day one. So that started. If you don't know, I am working for the USDA, the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. We've got a booth over there. I'd like to encourage anybody who's interested in applying afterwards to swing on over. Ron's right there. We've got several other DCs in the area. We want to make sure that we can hook you up with somebody that can help you or assist you down the path. We also have TSPs, Vic's one up here. We got Chris right there. They help write grazing plans too. So anybody who's new, just be aware of that. And I'd also like to point out that all these grazing pictures that I'm using through the slide, they're all from successful operations I've worked with, from 10 sheep up to 600 dairy heifers rotated to 250 cow-calf pairs to stockers. Like, that works whether you're in the southern part of the state or the northern part of the state. You have to be aware of some things when you're planning that. So, why would I want a grazing plan? I mean, you're thinking like, I can do this, I'll just put some fence out there and start grazing, right? I mean, it works. You can absolutely do that. There are a lot of people who just started by putting up a perimeter fence and buying polywire, and you can be 100% successful doing that. The reason I put this up here is we have people in the crowd here. You can call me, we've got Jason, we've got a lot of other people out here who've been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. I cannot stress the importance of learning from someone else's mistakes. You don't need to feel like you've got to reinvent the wheel. I still go across the state, and that's the opportunity I have with my position. I get to go everywhere across Wisconsin, and everywhere I go, someone still thinks that they're the first one that's rotational grazing. It's cool. I fully support them doing that, and they probably are in their neighborhood or their community, and they feel like they're a little bit on an island. But the reality is building upon what other people have done is something that I can't stress enough. So the importance of working with somebody to develop a plan can really jumpstart you into that process to be successful. So developing a plan. I use this picture here. This sounds like I got better microphone there. Sorry about this. I use this picture here. That's not a grazing picture. But most of the grazing plans that NRCS works with are actually cropland conversions. We're taking cropland back from row crop back to rotational grazing. But I don't want you to think that's the only way to do that. I have what I call a hit list, I'd say. Maybe it's a bit stalkerish, but I drive around the state, and if I see a dairy operation or beef operation that's just set stocked, and you look at the acres of the pasture, and all of a sudden you're like, man, they've got enough out there that if they would just subdivide, that they wouldn't have to be feeding all that feed out there. Every time I drive across the state, I see another operation that is continuously grazing or set stocking animals on a piece of property that's got almost enough or enough land that if they would just subdivide it and manage it, that they wouldn't have to feed a single bit of stored feed through the summertime. That's really important to me because before we even start talking about conservation, I'm talking about keeping people into their operations, keeping them successful for the long term. So what we do is, grazing for us is a conservation, but it's practice to keep water, clean, soil in place. But the reality is, just because that's the NRCS goals doesn't mean that your goals can't align with ours and we can't push in the same direction. So when we're developing a grazing plan with the NRCS, with the USDA, there's a couple things that we go through. We've got what we call 9 steps of planning, and we do that internally. Our planning process is very structured. It may not seem like that when you're working with us, but we are actually going through a step-by-step system that we follow, and that's how we work internally, so you know a little bit about us. And it's not a bad way to plan. But the one thing I want to stress to everybody as you're going through this plan, if you are looking for a plan from the NRCS, the owner or the operator makes the decisions, not the planner or the conservation employee. So if you did happen to get a plan from somebody who's out there, and they wrote you a plan, and you're like, I just don't like this. Well, start over. Don't think that you need to take a plan from the NRCS or the USDA and that's what you gotta do. Now, if you wanna do something that doesn't meet our standards, we might not be there to offer cost share, but we're not here to tell you what to do on your property. NRCS is not about enforcing, we're about helping. The one thing though that I do wanna stress though, the opportunity with the planner or the USDA employee or land conservation staff or TSP is coming back to that, their knowledge. You know, one of the best things that I get to do, I've been on hundreds of grazing farms. And if I take just one thing that's positive and one thing that's negative from each farm, think about what that does over the course of a career. And I've got the ability to share that with you. And more importantly, I've got the ability, and so does every district conservationist or everybody working in the grazing field, to actually introduce you to those people. The grazing community is very open, and like I said, if you're curious about something, reach out, because there's a good chance that we can find somebody who's doing what you were thinking about doing out of a similar size operation, and they are willing to talk about it. And don't be scared to ask what sucked. The biggest mistake I see people do is they're like, oh, this is great, everything about this is fantastic. Well, that's the last question you should be asking. You should be asking, what don't you like? Because the last thing you want to do, and this has happened where we've got people in the grazing, they're like, this just isn't for me. It's better to get that figured up ahead of time. Not everybody's wired to be a grazer. You don't have to be a grazer. But what I will say though is that if we're talking about business or economics, I will go toe to toe with anybody when we start talking about true business, economics, and the benefits of grazing. I don't care if you don't want to graze, but don't tell me it doesn't work. So the other thing that we do, and I think everybody needs to do, is we need to determine the goals and the objectives. That sounds kind of, it's very holistic, but it's very important. Know where you're going. We do internally a resource inventory and evaluation. I'm going to go into detail on more of these in the next couple slides. System designs and maintenance. So what are your goals? Producer specific. You know, what do you want this to be? The first thing that I come out when I talk to somebody, if I'm the one that's actually doing the grazing plan, I'm not coming out there saying, hey, we need to subdivide. No, the question should be, what are you doing here? Where do you want this to go? What is this going to look like in 5 years? What's this going to look like in 20 years? Do you want to keep this? Is this a short-term enterprise? Is it a long-term enterprise? If that really can impact the way you start things and think. So I really encourage you, if you're starting a grazing system or you're starting to transition to a grazing system, to really think about where that's going. And a lot of people do this, but sometimes just having that actual sit down and talking about where that is, some new ideas or potential issues or problems come to light. The other thing is communicate well with labor. This is one of those things where, you know, learn from experience, learn the hard way. I've got plenty of things that I wish I'd done different. I got a real great experience with communicate well with labor. So I help set up a lot of large dairies, and they graze their heifers. The owners are super excited about having their heifers go out on pasture, right? They can't get them out fast enough. I'm like, this is fantastic. You know what we didn't do in that whole conversation? We didn't talk to the people who are actually going to be managing the animals. So if you're on a larger dairy, and this could go for, it could just be the husband and wife, you know, it just, you need to have these conversations. But my specific example was, if you're in a CAFO setting, 2,000 cows, and you want to start putting your bred heifers out on pasture, chances are the employees out there like driving tractor and big equipment. That's why they're there. Now all of a sudden they're told to manage heifers and put them on grass. It was almost a really big mistake. So luckily we were able to work through it. They actually hired somebody else, and that actually turned out to be a really great grazing plan. But a good, strong communication between, who's going to actually be doing the work. If we're talking about grazing planning, and this is all stuff that you should be doing up front. You could have this in the first conversation, the first visit, and then review it periodically. This is not going to be like a stagnant, set in stone type of plan. When we do grazing plans for NRCS, I tell our planners to think about it as 85% right, and that's going to work for about the first year. And then, examples about what you're trying to do. Are you trying to make a profit? Hopefully, accumulate land, maybe increase your stocking rate if you're in a continuously grazed situation. If you start subdividing it, you can probably add on 25 to 50% more animals depending on where you're at. Maybe it's deer, butterflies, birds, who knows? These are all things to talk about. So this is very much where NRCS starts to help people outside of where your probably normal train of thought is with grazing planning. We got the labor, the rented land, the soils. So if you know much about the NRCS, or if you don't know anything about the NRCS, we start out as a soil conservation service. So all of our work and everything we do is usually based in and around soils. So the entire state of Wisconsin is mapped, and most of the United States is mapped. And we've got a ton of data out there. So if you guys aren't aware of this, check a web soil survey, go to your site, check that out. You can find out a lot of information about your property. But all of our work starts with soils and understanding the soils. We know based off of where you live and the soils there, we can get good estimates for what type of yields you have. We know if there's bedrock there. Bedrock may be important. Maybe you just bought a piece of property and you're like, I want to put a buried pipeline and winter water on the back corner there. But if you've got bedrock within 6 inches of the surface there, this might be something you want to know before you get the contractor there. This is all free. You can check this out yourself. Plants, type, and condition. We go out on site, we do inventories to see what's actually there, and then we also can recommend what's going on. Some of the things that I really like to encourage people is build on experience. Not all plants work well together. There's a lot of conversation about salad bar mixes. I'm completely in favor of them, but not usually for beginners, if I'm going to give you my personal opinion. The reason being is because you've got a very diverse mix that can be a very big challenge to manage. Keep it simple, plant species that grow well in the soils you got, and then as you develop as a grazing manager, add what you want. And then finally, kind, type, number of livestock. So I've surveyed most of the plans that I've asked or put together, and a lot of other plans that people have done. And one of the best things that NRCS can do for you as a producer is how many animals can you put out there? Or a TSP, how many animals can be out there? One of the big mistakes that people think is if I'm grazing, that I'm going to lose production or I'm going to lose the carrying capacity of my property. That's a huge mistake. What you need to think about this is you're harvesting forage differently. But you need to know what you can actually carry on site, and it's got to be based in sound numbers and realistic goals. So when we talk system designs, actually before we talk about this is one of my favorite, let's call them case studies. This is Justin. I met Justin when I was a soil econ in Wapaka, and this right up here was his 30-acre pasture, and he had 20 cow-calf pairs, and he was able to graze these animals till about the end of June. And he read this crazy article in No-Till Farmer about this guy out in South Dakota doing rotational grazing and how he was working with his NRCS office. So Justin came in, and that's when I first found out about Gabe Brown. And I've been in the grazing circles for a long time, but I didn't know who Gabe was. Anyways, we started talking. I told him what he could do with the system up here, and the only thing we did the first year was subdivide this top land here. You can't see it, it's more open on the backside. The only thing we did was subdivide with polywire into 4 different chunks and rotate it on a weekly basis. The first year, he went from being done grazing by the beginning of July. He grazed till September just by doing that, which was pretty fun. And that was a real fun experience, which allowed him to be hey, I want to take more land and put more land into production. One of the other fun caveats with this story is his wife told me while he was sitting there that under no circumstance will he ever have more than 20 cow-calf pairs. I don't know if you can count there, but it's bigger than that now. He's up to like 150 now. So, it's never easy, but we actually went in and we made the systems flexible. Like he has huge custom operators come there and they sell their forage. So he's got this set up so that way he can easily rotate his cows through his fields. He can also come in there and he can, have a custom operator come in there and harvest the forage. But the other really cool thing about Justin, and I'm going to say this, and it's not just this easy because we're still learning a lot, but he's the first producer that's shooting at grazing 365 days a year. The big caveat is mud season. He's doing a lot with annuals and covers and really trying to extend the season. But the nice thing about this is he was one of the first people that we really started to get some good numbers on, how much you can save by really extending the season. And I know Jason might be talking more about that later, so I'll let him do that. So if you haven't seen a soils map, this is what they look like. See all these little squiggly lines here? What that means is all those lines are individual shape files is what we call them. And those are basically soil units that are very similar. So if you got a wetland soil, if you got a sandy soil, if you got a loam soil, these are basically ways to subdivide this. So can you see, this is a challenging one, but can you start to see, like if you've got this lower wet soil, how maybe you can start to use a plan map or a soils map like this to start giving you ideas where to put fences? And that's something we do with the grazing plan is we start to subdivide these into these field units. So if you work with NRCS, the goal is not just to put fences out there. The goal is to tie the soils to the fences so you've got a management system. Say you've got this little horseshoe here is super wet, and then you just go across here. And this is small enough that you probably would, but say this is bigger than that. If you've got 2 or 3 or 4 different distinct soil types in one pasture, and you're putting them in there and you're just doing a regular rotation, but you haven't thought about that because you're just putting fence out there, can you see how that starts to be challenging to manage? Can you see the lost opportunity from managing the wet soils with the dry soils with species that can be actually utilize those characteristics of those soils? So one of the goals that we try to do is to start subdividing these into planting units or land units so that way you as a producer can actually go out there and manage that. A wet site might be grazed 4 times more often on a dry year, or it might not be grazed the next year at all. And if you've got that broken down, that allows you to do that. If you just start putting fences out, you're probably going to figure that out on your own after 3, 4, 5 years. But, why not use the tools we got? The other thing is critical and sensitive areas, and I'm going to show you some maps about this later. But there's a lot to be said with this, and our critical and sensitive areas that we call out, that we're required to call those out based off of our standards within the agency. But the other thing is you're going to want to know where those are too. And examples of this would be wetlands, SWCMA, surface water quality areas, concentrated flow paths, that place where the water runs down through the field. Can I just get a show of hands who outwinters here? Does anybody outwinter? Got a couple outwinters? All right, let's just talk about a 5-inch deluge in the summertime. Just not even outwintering. Let's just talk. You got one hill over here and one hill over there, and you got a swale through the middle. You got this deluge down the center, and you're going to take your cows back through this swale. Now, if you could run those pastures so that way that swale was its own unit, or crossing it, which way do you think you're going to destroy less pasture? That's what I'm talking about with using critical and sensitive areas to help plan. It doesn't always work, but I'm surprised at how often it actually does. And then finally, we've got the foundation. Our soils are the foundation for engineering practices. Sandy soils can't support the same weight if you're talking about equipment as like a clay soil. So we use that for stream crossings, for access roads, for trails and walkways, stuff like that. And then the livestock inventory. Actually, this is another great friend of mine. He's a fun guy. He's got some cows up there, and everybody around him is huge dairy, row crops. He's definitely the oddball out with these cows sitting in the middle of the fields. He's actually kind of the one where you can really show these pictures here. If you build it, they'll come. If you've got an interest in wildlife and birds, even if you don't have an interest in wildlife and birds, you put a bunch of pasture out there and you're going to see what comes in real quick. So the other thing we work on is talking about what the site can actually carry. And we do that by seeing what you've got now, where you're gonna go. Most times, we're working with people who are planning on building or adding more animals too. So if you've got 20 cow-calf pairs right now and you wanna go up to 40, that's awesome, but can you do it? Don't know. It depends on what soils you got, how much acreage you have. And that's when I said the true benefit when we talk about developing a grazing plan. And that also comes back to the forage needs. So with our planning process, with the calculators we got, and just so everyone knows, Lynn shared a link online. All the same tools that NRCS uses are available to everybody here. If you want to write your own grazing plan, I completely encourage you to do that. We'll walk you through that. Really start playing around with this. Nothing that we use it's all available to every single person here. You're not going to be more successful than if you take a hand in the process yourself. So please take a look at that, think about that. And these calculators, these Excel spreadsheets, they're very simple. Play around, see what you got. But the thing about that is, and this is where it's going to be really nice to have somebody who knows how to run these. The saying garbage in, garbage out. Like maybe you're assuming you've got soils that have 3-ton yields. Maybe, I'm surprised at how many soils, or maybe you've got that really great soil ridge over here that gives you 4 tons of dry matter, and that's what you're gonna put into that calculator. But if you start thinking that maybe you got 20% of your farm is maybe only 1,000 pounds of dry matter, if you don't account for that, you're gonna be overstocked. Go ahead.
What is it look like?
So Lynn, you said the link, where are you at, Lynn? There, it's the Wisconsin NRCS homepage, and then just Google FOTG, FOTG, Field Office Technical Guide, and then you go into conservation planning, and then there's a pasture portion of that. And I can show you later too, but that hot link that link is providing should take you directly to that. And there's different forms there, there's different calculators there. There's the checklist that we actually go through for our grazing plan, so you know what we're looking at as well. No secrets. So the forage needs ties to soils. So this is what that forage animal balance sheet looks like, all right? So I put this up here because we're talking about grazing planning. And this number at the bottom is oftentimes one of the first things that people want to know when we talk about what a plan can do for you. So in this particular example, I've got animals that weigh 1,200 pounds, and I got 40 of them, so that's the cows. 300 pounds and 40 for the calves, and we got one 1,800 pound bull. So you got to be careful. There's a couple nuances that you learn as a planner. The interesting thing that happens is, say we actually took this number up to, I bet you if we went up to 50, we'd be at about the 90%. So let's say 50 is probably what the site could carry using these numbers. The problem is that this is a linear equation, and it doesn't account for summer slump, and it doesn't account for the spring flush or the fall flush. If you max this calculator out, there's a good chance you're going to be feeding feed in the summertime. So that's why I said use these tools, but understand their limitations. Grass doesn't grow in a straight line. You get by far more yield in May than you do any other month, and you got to recognize that. So as a planner, what you need to be doing, and that's what we do internally, is we plan for the low months so you can graze the entire year and set that up so you can harvest on both ends. Now, if you don't want to do that, like if your plan is like you want to bring animals in, bring them out, or maybe you don't mind pulling them off, that's fine. We're not here to tell you what to do, but in my experience, you're probably better off planning for the low month if your intention is to graze as many days as possible. So using your plan. That's a nice picture. That's up in Door County. So you have land, all right? And this is an actual grazing plan. This was a plan I started with a gentleman probably 2014, 2015, I can't remember. I hope you can all see this. We've got a river here. We've got acreage over here. You got these green areas right here. So I'm not sure how familiar you are all with soil interpretation or photo interpretation, but for me, when I look at this green area typically indicates that it's wet. We got another wet spot right here. This different color here, that's wet. We've got a draw through here. you know, we've got a lot going on here. This gentleman wants to graze, and when I look at this, I'm like, this is a perfect place to put in grass from a conservation stance, because all these are concentrated flows. You want to know the best way to actually stop soil and fertilizer from getting into a river? Grass. That's why NRCS likes grazing. You know, we're very much in favor. If I'm going to be 100% honest, like, my goal is more than just conservation with grazing planning. But the reason NRCS cost shares on fencing and water lines and lanes and grazing planning is because of the conservation benefit. And what other practice do we have that actually gives you all of that? Plus, if you do it right, a huge economic potential, the ability to stay on the property, to buy property, to support your family. So the other thing I want to point with this operation here is, notice we got like these fields that are running north and south here. This is a big field break here. We got this, you know, scrubby old fence line here. And, you know, when I met with this gentleman, you know, his plan was to put a fence around the perimeter and run, you know, basically using these old field boundaries. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The one thing, though, that I would stress, though, is if we're talking about converting a system onto your property, this is the system that worked for the last 50 years. And it might be the exact system that you need for the next 50 years, but maybe it's not. And a lot of times when you're the owner, or you've been on this place for the last 30 years, it's sometimes hard to think outside of that box that you've kind of put around yourself. So the opportunity to bring somebody else in with fresh eyes, it's amazing. And the cool thing about it is paper's cheap. Digital copies are even cheaper now. Now I just email maps back and forth, and we have computer discussions, and we draw layouts, and I don't even need a printer to do that anymore. But you can start really throwing out some ideas. And you can say, man, I really like this portion of layout 1, and this layout 2 absolutely sucks. We're not doing that. Maybe we can merge 1 and 3 together, and what about this? We'll throw this on there, and all of a sudden you've been a huge part of your grazing plan, and we've got a system that's maybe going to be allowing you to be more successful going forward. Is it always going to work? No. We try to make it work, though. So when I come to maps, I've removed most of the data here, all the data that would be give you an idea of who this would be. But this is a contour map, and we as the agency have a ton of opportunity to give you these maps. One thing before I get too far into this, all these maps are GeoPDFs. Every FSA map that you get is a GeoPDF. There's an app called Avenza where you can get those maps emailed to yourself, and then you can upload them in there. And then if you're building a fence plan, have them send you that fence design, and you can upload it in there. And you can walk out using your phone. And if your phone's accurate, you've got all that right there. Everything that's a GeoPDF can be put into there. So when we start talking about how your grazing plan can be useful for you, those maps alone and being able to upload them, they can give you the acreage for your daily break.
What was that app called?
Avenza. So I love it. I use it all the time. I use it to flag out. You know, we used to have Trimble units that were $30,000. We can do almost the same level of accuracy with our phone and that app. And I'm sure there's other apps out there too. I'm not going to say that's the only one, but that one works really easy. And any map that's directly downloaded from NRCS, from Conservation Desktop, or out of ArcMap, those are all GeoPDFs. That means that all these points on there have a geo coordinate to them. So that coordinate directly relays onto your phone. So it'll give you a little indicator for where you're standing. So for this particular one, I didn't use this layout, but you can see this black line here. That's a fence. I laid this out, and actually Randy Cutler, you were probably in on this site. I know Edward was there. I'm not sure if he came there. But I laid this out. You know what's amazing is, so you can see how this used to go north and south, but we changed this to east and west. You don't realize it until you start laying out fence, but you know how much slope you don't need in order to not be able to see over the 40. So if you've got the ability to use a map to help you, pin this end and that end, or to put your gates where you want, or when we start talking about those critical and sensitive areas, if we're going to actually hit developed field units, you can start using those maps for that. So this is the actual grazing plan map you can see, but the other thing that came back, if you look back and forth to this, and this is why when I talk about grazing planning, these are things that maybe a lot of people aren't thinking about. We start talking about using your plan and starting that plan to get go. You know, why you would think about maybe doing things different. This is the topography map, but it also is tying back to the soils on this next one. You can see this wet area. You can't maybe see this. I look at maps when I see contours like this. I've been looking at maps long enough. In my mind, they kind of go 3D. Not everyone does that. But you can see that this is a low area, this is a low area, and this is a low area. So look at what we've got here. Based off of true LiDAR imagery, which is accurate to like 1/10 of an inch in this county. Look at how we're able to break these wet units out and keep them as their own management units. This wet unit here, you know, why would you put that weird fence there? Well, because every year that area floods. And not only do we know where it floods, but we can know very accurately where the contours are there. So now if you know you have a Venza or you got this map, you can follow that line and be very accurate about where you're placing those fence posts and have a relatively high percentage of accuracy about how to actually build these fences that can facilitate longer management and better management. Not only that, but we know that that's going to be wet. So they're out of there when it's wet. But hey, you know, that's probably a great place to be in June, July. Maybe you graze this one. There's a delay here, I'm sorry. Maybe you graze this 3 or 4 times in the summer, and this sandy knoll over here, maybe that only gets grazed once. Because it's its own unit, you can manage it that way. So that comes back now to the critical and sensitive areas that we're talking about. These are things that a lot of times, this is very much NRCS jargon kind of when we start talking, but these are good things to know. This red area right here, does anybody have any idea what that is? I'd like someone just to shout out. Why would I call this little red area?
Is that a grass waterway?
It is a grass waterway. It's not actually a developed or designed grass waterway, but it's a concentrated flow path. Nothing wrong with grazing any of that. I encourage you to graze that. Like, you know, if you're putting cows out, you graze a wetland if you want, as long as it's not standing water and you're making a muddy mess. We're not out here to say that. Like, there's true advantage to putting animals out there and maintaining these grass ecosystems. But knowing where these areas are, there might be some other implications that we can use by understanding how to plan these out. So, like I said before, see how, if we go back to that original map, see how this kind of boxes out all those wet spots. If I just go back here and we look at this, see this wet area here, this wet area here, we got this wet area here, and how that comes through there. And before we were going to run these pastures when we originally met north and south, which wouldn't have been a problem, except for this gentleman was very interested in bale grazing. So he wanted to keep his animals out there year round. And when you start to look at how this breaks down going north and south versus bale grazing, it gets to be more problematic when you start thinking about where to put winter watering facilities out here and how to manage that. So we talked about this, we went back and forth both ways, and we wound up on this layout, which I'm happy to say he's very happy with. The other thing you'll notice here too is, man, you're like, those fences, that looks like a lot of interior fence. Everyone gets real nervous when they see a lot of lines crossing their property. Yeah, it's more fence than you would need if you're not planning on grazing in the wintertime. Anyone have any idea why we put those fences there like that? I'd love for someone just to shoot some ideas out at me. If you're a bale grazer, give me some ideas. You raise your hand. You got volunteered.
More strategic animal traction and, I guess, placement on the land.
That's exactly what it was. This was designed so that way. This grazing plan was designed with his winter management in mind more than his summer management. So these distances are about 250 to 300 feet apart. That's about the distance that we talked about that would work really good for him to give us a week's worth ahead of time so that he could connect his polywire from one hard hot wire to another hard hot wire. So that way he can move across there and start managing that. That's why we did that. If he didn't want to put all these fences in there and he wanted to do a different, you could absolutely do this. There's no right way to set up a grazing plan. This is my quote. There is absolutely wrong ways of doing it though. So the only thing that I care about when I leave your property as a USD employee is that you're happy with it, you like it, and you have a potential to be successful. That's what we're interested in. Otherwise, why are we investing money into it? And if we give you this glorious plan that you are not interested in, who cares? If you're not gonna do it, who cares, right? So, this is the actual grazing plan map, and this is the map that we actually laid the fences out on, and Randy in the back there, he helped with this. I don't know if you were there or helped, maybe Edward built it, but you definitely had trailers out there. Randy and I go way back. Here's the other interesting thing. So based off of that critical and sensitive area map, now we've got these areas that are no-go, do not place round bales in the bale grazing area. We know they're wet. And then we've got these areas to pre-place there. Well, why do we care? I care very much about bale grazing because I think it's one of the best ways for the average beef farmer to be profitable in Wisconsin. I also think that I don't want it to ever be regulated to the, I got 10 minutes. I gotta keep going here. I want to make sure that we're doing this right. I want to make sure that those nutrients, when we're putting them out there, stay on place so that way the grass can use them. And so that way we're not worried about permits or nutrient runoff or manure spills or some silliness like that because we didn't plan for that ahead of time. So let's take a look. We've got this opportunity. We put this there. Notice how I've got this swale marked out there. That doesn't mean you can't place bales across there. If you're bale grazing in this situation, we know the cows are going to spend 90% of their time next to the bales. So who cares if they're walking through there as long as it's not muddy? So this is the type of system that looks like. And this is the actual air photo of the site now. Notice the fences. Notice how straight they are. That was me. But I think what I like about this picture more than anything, and it might be difficult for you to see in the back, notice that this was the first year he bale grazed, and you can see where he put the bales. You can also see how he avoided those concentrated flow paths, and you can see how those pastures and those fence lines allowed him to manage so that way he wasn't putting them in spots that weren't. I know for a fact that he used Avenza when he was doing this. So you talk about what a grazing plan can do for you. You know, there's a lot from just helping you determine your forage animal balance to helping you do the long-term management and even just documenting what you've got out there for grasses long-term. The other thing you need to think about is, I guarantee that you're like, man, I bale grazed here. I'm going to remember that I was here 5 years ago. No, you're not. So document that. And if you've got these maps, that we'll give you them. We'll give you as many copies as you want. We'll give you digital copies from the USDA. Ron loves printing out maps. He'll give you all those maps. Use them as a tool. It's an absolute tool, and Pat's back here too, so don't let him get off the hook either. It's an absolute tool that you can use for long-term management on these sites. The other thing to do, I've got 10 minutes, this is what I was talking about before for understanding your forages. This is the other important thing with grazing. And if I can get new grazers to only do one thing right their first year, if I am completely successful, if you as a new grazer start to understand the importance of residual. Understanding how grass grows so that way you can actually maximize what you're getting off of that. That's the only thing that's important. If people cut hay to 3 inches because it's super expensive to come back there with equipment and harvest it, how much does it cost you to run a cow over a field 3, 4, 5 times a year? It doesn't cost you anything except a little bit of time, but you're going to spend that time anyways. So leave 4, 5, or 6 inches out there so you can work with the way that grass grows. This is what I was talking about with those growth curves. I don't remember which grasses they were, kind of print out funny, but you get more grass in May and June. You get this summer slump they call in August and then October. If you're planning on just an even line, which is unfortunately what that tool does, it's planning like this. You can see how once you get to July, you're going to start running in a deficit if you don't understand how that actually works. So that's one of the benefits with working with someone who understands those tools are. And once you understand that, go be dangerous. The other thing that I want new grazers to understand, and this is the benefit of working with people who do this, notice the days of growth here. Look at how steep this growth curve is. And this is the important part when we start talking about how people are able to get more dry matter production per acre. They're able to get more grass per acre. You start to increase your stocking rate. And what does dry matter per acre mean to a grazer? Greg, you know this one.
I should. I haven't been farming for a few years. Well, I mean, it's everything. It's what's really out there.
I'll simplify it. Money.
Yeah.
Dry matter per acre equals money. Every day on grass is saving you money. And if you graze up here, you're grazing when the grass is growing slower, so you've lost that growth potential. And if you graze down here, look at how long that takes for that to actually pick up speed again. Imagine if you can graze during this curve where it's growing exponentially as fast. I work with graziers who sometimes cover the same ground. The most I've had to deal with is up to 9 times in one season. That is not what I would say the beginning grazer is going to get, and it's not even typical. But because he was able to use his grazing plan and flex the system, he's actually able to make it work. He got a ton of forage off of that. And if you went out there, none of his grass was ever grazed below 5 inches. And he was usually getting on it in about that 12 to 14 inch range, which is what the grazing plan will give you those ranges to look at. So be flexible with what you're doing. This is not set in stone. This is a really good start. You know, paper's paper, but use it. I think the benefits that we offer as an agency are that upfront planning, potential cost share, and then also those maps that you can use and then come back and actually apply that as a field tool. And here it is. My good friend Jason, he's going to be talking about nutrient management. Internal joke, the other grazing specialist. We're friends. Now, nutrient management is super important. Don't underestimate this. This whole thought that you don't need to worry about that is a big mistake. Do you need to always put nutrients out there? Maybe, maybe not, but don't underestimate how important it is. Maintenance on these sites, you know, grass maintenance, understanding growth, physical structures, and then this is why NRCS cares. So this is close to where I live. Anybody got any idea? And I know Otto's getting nervous over there. Sorry, Otto. 4 minutes. Anybody got any idea where this is? Green Bay. Fox River. One of the best freshwater resources we've got. What is this brown stuff? Runoff. Kiwani clay. More specifically, what is that brown stuff? Sediment lost soil. Not only is it lost soil, it's the best lost soil. It's the topsoil. It's got the most organic matter, the most nutrients, the most everything, and we're letting it run into the river there. I'm very pro-agriculture. I grew up on a farm. I don't care if you're a grazer or a confinement or whatever. I want to see all farming work. But we can do something about this, and what I love about grazing is we absolutely can have a huge impact on the environment while bolstering a farm's profitability and also reducing labor and home life. Like, there's just no downside if you do this right. And that's before you even start talking about the birds and the butterflies and all the other fun stuff that gets real exciting too. In general, we've got solid science that shows 24% less sediment loss, and I know it's more than that. Less phosphorus, less soluble P, less volatilization of nitrogen, lower greenhouse gases, and a 25% smaller carbon footprint. The big ones right here in Wisconsin are going to be these P runoff, because that's the limiting nutrient in most of our state waters. If you took 1 pound of phosphorus and poured into the majority of the waters in Wisconsin, you're going to wind up with 800 to 1,400 pounds of algae on a dry weight basis, because it's got everything else it needs except for phosphorus. Phosphorus gets into our water typically through soil erosion, and then there's some, once you're really saturated, it'll actually go through dissolved. So, questions?